Imagine being chosen, plucked from your family, dressed in silk, painted like a porcelain goddess, and delivered to the most powerful man in the world. You are told this is an honor. You are told your family will be blessed. You are told that within these walls, you will live a life of luxury beyond imagination. What they don't tell you is that thousands of women before you were swallowed by those same walls and never came out. What they don't tell you is that the palace you just entered is not a home, it's a machine, and you are its fuel. For over 2,000 years, the imperial courts of China operated one of the most elaborate, secretive, and ruthlessly controlled systems of human organization the world has ever seen. At its center, hidden behind painted screens, lacquered doors, and centuries of official silence were the concubines. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. Women whose names were erased, whose stories were buried, and whose lives were considered so beneath the dignity of official record that entire dynasties tried to pretend they barely existed. But they did exist. And what happened to them inside those palace walls is one of history's most disturbing and most fascinating untold stories. This is what Chinese emperors really did to their concubines, and why so much of it was deliberately erased from history. To understand the concubine system, you first have to understand the world it was born into. China's imperial age begins in 221 BCE, when a warlord king named Ying Zheng, a man of terrifying ambition and absolute ruthlessness, crushed the 6 rival kingdoms of the Warring States period and declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. He didn't just unify China politically, he tried to unify it spiritually, philosophically, and dynastically. He wanted to create something permanent, something eternal, an empire that would last 10,000 generations. To do that, he needed sons, many sons, because in a world without guaranteed succession, where a single illness or battlefield arrow could end a dynasty overnight, the emperor's bloodline was the empire itself. The more heirs you had, the more insurance the state possessed. The logic was almost mathematical. More women meant more children meant more heirs. More heirs meant more stability. This wasn't unique to China. Pharaohs had harems. Ottoman sultans maintained the infamous institution they called the harem. Persian kings surrounded themselves with hundreds of wives. But what made the Chinese imperial concubine system singular? What made it unlike anything else in the ancient or medieval world was its sheer scale, its bureaucratic precision, and the extraordinary lengths to which it went to control every aspect of these women's lives and bodies. By the time the system reached its peak, particularly during the Han, Temps, and Ming dynasties, an emperor's inner court could house anywhere from hundreds to literally thousands of women. The Ming dynasty records, incomplete as they are, suggest some emperors kept upwards of 9,000 women inside the Forbidden City. 9,000 women in a single palace complex, and almost none of them would ever see the emperor's face. Let's slow down here, because this is the part that most history books skip over entirely. When we say concubine, we need to dissolve the romanticized image that word might conjure the mysterious beauty lounging on silk cushions. Powerful through seduction, a key player in court intrigue. Yes, that version of history exists. Yes, some concubines wielded extraordinary influence. We'll get to them, but they were the exceptions, the rare few who rose above a system designed to keep women invisible, obedient, and replaceable. For the vast majority, entry into the imperial harem began not with romance, but with inspection. Every few years, imperial talent scouts, eunuchs, and female officials would travel the provinces of China, conducting what were called selection drafts. Families with daughters between the ages of 13 and 16 were required by law in many periods to present them for inspection. This was not optional. Refusal to participate could result in fines, punishment, or accusations of disloyalty to the throne. The girls were evaluated like livestock, their height measured, their teeth examined, their skin assessed, their voices tested, their feet inspected, their family backgrounds investigated for any trace of disease, moral failing, or political unreliability. Those who passed were taken. That was the word used in documents of the time. Taken, their families were given a small payment and the theoretical honor of having contributed a daughter to the Son of Heaven. The girl herself was given a new name, new clothing, new quarters, and was told she now belonged to the emperor. Not metaphorically, legally, her old life was over. She could not marry anyone else. She could not leave. She could not refuse. She would likely never see her family again. Once inside the Forbidden City, the new concubine entered a world that functioned like a city unto itself, a bureaucratic universe governed by ritual, hierarchy, and surveillance, so total that it makes modern surveillance states look almost casual by comparison. The women were ranked in a system that varied slightly by dynasty, but generally operated across 9 tiers. The very top sat the empress, the official wife, the mother of the nation, whose position was one of the most politically consequential in the empire. Below her came the imperial noble consort, then noble consorts, then concubines, then beauties, then talented ladies, and so on down through ranks, so minor they barely had names. Your rank determined everything: where you slept, what you ate, how many servants attended you, whether you were allowed to walk in certain gardens, how many candles you were permitted in winter, what color of clothing you could wear, what ceremony you were entitled to upon death. Most women entered at the lowest rungs, and most women stayed there, because advancement through the ranks depended almost entirely on one thing: access to the emperor. And access to the emperor was controlled, rationed, and managed by one of the most powerful and most disturbing figures in imperial court life: the eunuch. To understand the concubine system, you have to understand the eunuchs who ran it. And to understand the eunuchs, you have to confront something that modern audiences often find almost impossible to process. These were men who had been castrated. Voluntarily, in many cases, though voluntary in a context of extreme poverty and limited options is a complicated word. Castration was the price of admission to one of the most powerful positions available to a commoner in Imperial China. Eunuchs could not father children, and therefore could not build rival dynasties. They could not threaten the emperor's bloodline. They were, in theory, perfectly safe servants, men who had sacrificed their masculinity in exchange for proximity to power. In practice, eunuchs accumulated extraordinary influence. They controlled access to the inner palace. They managed the schedules, movements, and activities of every concubine in the harem. They decided which women the emperor saw, when, and for how long. They kept records of the emperor's sexual activity, yes, actual written records, maintained by eunuch officials, noting which woman was summoned, which night, and whether conception might have resulted. This wasn't voyeurism. This was state administration, because every child born in the inner palace had to have its parentage documented with absolute certainty. The stakes were dynastic succession, the most important political question in the empire. Any ambiguity about a child's father was not just a personal scandal, but a potential constitutional crisis. So eunuchs recorded everything, and in doing so, they accumulated leverage. They knew which concubines the emperor favored. They knew which ones he had ignored for years. They knew which women had powerful family connections, which ones were scheming for advancement, and which ones had quietly given up hope. And some eunuchs used that knowledge to devastating effect. But before we follow that thread into the corridors of power, we need to talk about the reality faced by the women at the bottom, because this is the part of history that was most aggressively erased. Consider what it meant to live your entire life in the Forbidden City without ever being chosen. A woman selected into the imperial harem in her early teens might wait years, decades for an imperial summons that never came. During that time, she would wake every morning, perform her rituals of grooming and preparation, learn the protocols of court, practice music or calligraphy or embroidery, and wait. She would watch other women age around her. She would hear rumors about which concubine had been summoned, which had given birth, which had been elevated to a higher rank. She would calculate, with the clarity that only endless patience produces, that with thousands of women competing for the attention of one man, the mathematics of her situation were essentially hopeless, and yet she could not leave. Some women spent 60 years inside the Forbidden City. They had entered as girls and died as old women without ever exchanging a word with the emperor they technically belonged to. Their entire lives, their youth, their fertility, their capacity for human connection had been consumed by a system that needed their presence more than it needed them as individuals. When these women died, their passing was recorded, if at all, in the briefest possible terms: a name, a rank, a date. Nothing of who they had been, nothing of what they had felt. The Qing dynasty's palace records are filled with entries like this: beauty name, deceased year, no issue. That's it. A human life compressed into 7 words. This erasure was not accidental. It was policy. Because the concubine system only worked if the women inside it remained invisible. The moment these women became individuals with documented histories, emotional lives, political opinions, they became problems. The system was designed to maintain the emperor's absolute authority and the dynastic bloodline's purity. Women who developed their own identities, their own networks, their own ambitions, threatened both. So, official history, written by male scholars employed by the court, systematically minimized the presence of concubines. Emperors' personal lives were considered private in a very specific way. Not private from the eunuchs who documented everything, but private from the historical record that future generations would read. The details of the inner palace were considered vulgar, unworthy of official annals. What this means, practically, is that we have extraordinarily detailed records of diplomatic missions, military campaigns, philosophical debates, and administrative reforms, and almost nothing about the lives of the hundreds or thousands of women who lived at the very center of imperial power. What we do have comes from fragments. From poetry written by concubines and sometimes preserved, from the memoirs of court ladies, from gossip recorded in unofficial histories that scholars of the time considered beneath serious attention, from the occasional dramatic case that was simply too politically significant to suppress entirely, and from archaeology. Because while official history could be controlled, the ground could not. Excavations of imperial tombs have revealed some of the most disturbing truths about what happened to concubines, particularly at death. In the earliest periods of Chinese history, before Confucian ethics began reshaping court practice, the death of an emperor sometimes meant the death of his concubines. This practice, called accompanying in death or zunzang, was literal human sacrifice. Women who had belonged to the emperor were expected to follow him into the afterlife, either by suicide or by execution. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, is one of the most archaeologically significant sites in the world, famous for the terracotta army discovered in 1974. But less discussed are the secondary burials found around the main tomb. Evidence suggests that many of the emperor's concubines, women who had not yet borne children, and therefore had no son to protect their status, were buried with him. Some appear to have been buried alive. We know this not from official records, which are diplomatically vague on the matter, but from the positioning of skeletons, from signs of hasty interment, from marks on bone that suggest some individuals were not peacefully laid to rest. This practice was not confined to the Qin dynasty. Archaeological evidence suggests it continued in various forms through the early Han period. It would re-emerge controversially during the Ming dynasty, a moment we'll return to in detail, because it is one of the most disturbing documented episodes in the entire history of the system. For now, let's follow the story forward through time. Because the concubine system did not remain static, it evolved. It was reformed. It was weaponized. And it was occasionally turned, by extraordinary women, into something its designers never intended: a path to real power. The Han Dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, established many of the institutional forms that would define imperial governance for the next 2,000 years. It was also during the Han that the inner palace first became a genuine arena of political competition, a space where ambitious women and the families behind them could maneuver for influence in ways that threatened the emperor himself. The most famous early example is Empress Elle, wife of Han Gazu, the dynasty's founder. Technically, an empress rather than a concubine, her story nonetheless illustrates the dynamics that would play out among consorts for centuries. When her husband, the emperor, developed a powerful attachment to a favored concubine named Lady Qi, Empress Elle began to fear for the succession. Lady Qi's son was receiving preferential treatment. He became the next emperor. Empress Elle and her own son would be politically and physically vulnerable. Empress Elle waited. She endured. She played the long game that women in the imperial system had to play. And when the emperor died, she moved with ruthless efficiency. Lady Qi was arrested, had her hands and feet amputated, her eyes gouged out, her ears destroyed, her voice taken with a drug, and was then displayed in a latrine as what Empress Elle called a human swine. This story was recorded by the Han historian Sima Qian with unusual frankness, perhaps because it was too spectacular to suppress. But it illustrates something the system tried to hide, that beneath the silken ceremony, the inner palace was a space of genuine, lethal competition, where the stakes were not just status, but survival. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, represents perhaps the most dramatically documented case of a concubine wielding imperial power. And the story deserves its own extended telling, because it changed China. Her name was Wu Zixin. She entered the imperial harem at the age of 14 as a fifth-tier concubine to Emperor Taizong, a brilliant military strategist and one of China's most celebrated rulers. Wu was educated, sharp, and politically astute in ways that the concubine system was specifically designed to prevent from mattering. Under Taizong, she rose modestly in rank but was far from the inner circle. Then Taizong died. Under imperial law, concubines who had not borne children were to be sent to Buddhist convents upon the emperor's death, an elegant solution that removed them from the political board without the awkward violence of execution. Wu Zixin entered a convent. She shaved her head. She appeared by every official measure to be done. What happened next altered the course of Chinese history. Taizong's son, the new emperor Gaozong, had met Wu during his father's lifetime and had been captivated by her. He retrieved her from the convent, an act that was, by the standards of the time, deeply improper, even incestuous by Confucian reckoning, since she had been his father's woman. He made her a concubine. Then he elevated her above the sitting empress. Then he made her empress herself. As Gaozong's health deteriorated, she handled correspondence, made administrative decisions, and wielded the instruments of imperial power with a directness that her contemporaries found both impressive and horrifying. When Gaozong died, she became regent for her sons, and then, in 690 CE, she declared herself emperor, not empress consort, not regent, emperor, the son of heaven, the ruler of China in her own name. She ruled for 15 years. She reformed the civil examination system, elevated meritocracy over aristocratic birth, oversaw a period of relative prosperity, and was, by most administrative measures, a competent and effective ruler. She was also ruthless in a way that her male contemporaries were as well, but which, because she was a woman, was recorded with particular horror. She had rivals executed, including members of her own family. She reportedly had a former empress and a senior consort killed in ways that recalled what Empress Elle had done centuries earlier. She maintained a small group of male favorites, the equivalent, deliberately and provocatively, of the concubines male emperors kept. When she died and the Tang Dynasty resumed conventional male rule, the court historians got to work. Not erasing her, she was too historically significant for that, but framing her. Her reign was recorded with a persistent undertone of moral horror. She was described as unnatural, monstrous, a violation of the cosmic order. The men who came after her worked hard to ensure that her example remained an anomaly, unrepeatable, a cautionary tale rather than a model. And they largely succeeded. She was the only woman in Chinese history to rule in her own name. The system closed behind her like water over a stone. Let's talk about something that official history found especially difficult to address: sex, or more precisely, the bureaucratic management of imperial sex. Because even this most intimate of human activities was inside the Forbidden City, a matter of state administration. The ritual of imperial summoning was elaborate and, by modern standards, almost surreally depersonalized. An emperor who wished to spend the night with a concubine would not simply send a message. Instead, the names of eligible concubines were written on jade or ivory tablets. These tablets were presented to the emperor on a tray. He would select one by turning it face down. A eunuch would carry the tablet to the designated woman's quarters, announce the summons, and oversee the preparation of the woman for her night with the emperor. The concubine would be bathed, groomed, wrapped in a robe, and carried to the emperor's chambers. Reportedly because the act of being carried was thought to prevent concealment of weapons. She would enter the emperor's bed from the foot, a symbolic gesture of submission, and the eunuch would wait outside, periodically calling through the screen to remind the emperor of the time limits prescribed for such activities. Because there were time limits, too much time with any single woman was considered dangerous, not morally, but politically. A concubine who monopolized the emperor's attention could accumulate influence and disturb the delicate balance of the inner court. The eunuchs who managed the schedule were, in theory, protecting the emperor from exactly this kind of entanglement. The encounter would be recorded. Date, name, duration, notable observations. If the woman subsequently became pregnant, the record established paternity. If she did not, she returned to her quarters and waited for a summons that might not come again for years. This system strikes modern observers as dehumanizing to a degree that almost defies comprehension. And it was. But it also created an unexpected consequence, because access to the emperor was so tightly controlled and so politically significant. The gatekeepers of that access, the eunuchs, became extraordinarily powerful, and some of them abused that power in ways that the official record tried very hard not to document. There is substantial evidence, drawn from unofficial sources, legal cases, and the occasional scandal that broke through official suppression, that some eunuchs used their control over concubines for personal gain. Women who wanted to be summoned might pay bribes in jewelry, in silk, in whatever currency of favor they could access. Women who had offended a powerful eunuch might find their names perpetually absent from the selection tray. The eunuch hierarchy was itself a political ecosystem with factions and rivalries and long memories. Some of the darkest accounts in the fragmentary record of the inner palace involve not the emperor at all, but the power that lesser men exercised over women who had no recourse. These accounts were especially suppressed because they exposed an embarrassing structural contradiction. The system designed to protect the emperor's exclusive claim to his concubines had created a class of middlemen with enormous and largely unaccountable power over those same women. The Ming Dynasty, which ruled from 1368 to 1644, would witness some of the most dramatic examples of both the system's dysfunction and its brutal enforcement. And it is during the Ming that we encounter a moment so disturbing it deserves to be told in full, because it represents one of the most explicit instances of the fate that awaited concubines when they were no longer useful. The year is 1424. The Yongle Emperor, one of the Ming Dynasty's most accomplished rulers, the man who completed the Forbidden City and sponsored the great voyages of Zhenhe, is dead. Among the concubines of his inner court are a number of Korean women, selected during recruitment missions to the Korean Joseon dynasty, which was a tributary state of Ming China. These women had been sent as diplomatic gifts, young women from noble Korean families delivered to the Chinese emperor as part of the complex tribute system that defined Sino-Korean relations. One of these women, whose name appears in Korean records as Guan, had been a particular favorite of the Yongle Emperor. She was a skilled musician, an educated woman, and by the fragmentary accounts available, someone whose personality had made a genuine impression on the court. When the Yongle Emperor died, she was ordered to accompany him in death. The practice of zunzang human sacrifice at the imperial funeral, which had supposedly been abolished centuries earlier, had been quietly revived by the early Ming emperors. We know this primarily because of Korean sources, not Chinese ones. The Korean court kept records of the women it had sent to China, and when those women died, inquiries were made. The Korean records document several of these deaths in terms that Chinese official history preferred not to repeat. The accounts describe the condemned women being brought before the funeral bier, given a final meal, and then ordered to stand on stools with nooses around their necks. The stools were then removed. One of the Korean women called out for her mother as she died. This detail, preserved in a Korean chronicle, invisible in the Chinese record, is perhaps the most humanizing fragment we have from the entire history of the imperial concubine system. In the midst of a ritual designed to erase individuality, a young woman dying in a foreign country called out in her native language for the one person who had loved her before she was taken. Her name was remembered in Korea. In China, she barely existed. This practice of forced suicide at the emperor's death, women killed not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because they belonged to a man who is now dead, continued through the early Ming Dynasty. The best available evidence suggests it was abolished during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor around 1464, partly due to a growing recognition that it was difficult to square with Confucian ethics, which by that period had become increasingly dominant in court culture. But abolition was gradual and imperfect. Informal pressure on women to follow their emperor in death continued long after formal execution was discontinued. Women who chose to live after their emperor's death sometimes faced social censure. Women who killed themselves were honored, commemorated, even celebrated in official literature. The message was consistent. A concubine's highest virtue was loyalty to the death. The women who survived, who chose life, rarely appear in the historical record at all. There is another chapter of this story that most accounts overlook entirely, and it involves the children. The children born of concubines occupied one of the most ambiguous positions in all of imperial society. On one hand, they were the emperor's blood, potentially the next ruler of the most powerful nation on earth. On the other hand, their status depended entirely on their mother's rank, their father's favor, and the political calculations of factions who might have every reason to want them to fail. Imperial succession was one of the most reliably destabilizing forces in Chinese dynastic history. Because emperors had so many children by so many women, succession was almost never straightforward. Brothers competed, mothers competed through their sons. Eunuchs backed competing candidates. Empresses with no biological sons of their own might adopt a concubine's child, a practice that could either protect the child or eliminate the concubine's influence over him, depending on the circumstances. The history of dynasties is filled with princes who were raised by women, not their mothers, who never knew where they came from, whose biological mothers were demoted or erased from the record to make political space for the fiction that the empress was their true parent. One of the most extraordinary examples of this dynamic comes from the Wanli Emperor of the Ming Dynasty, whose story reads less like imperial history and more like a fairy tale, except that the darkness at its center is entirely real. The Wanli Emperor, who ruled from 1487 to 1505, was by all accounts one of the most personally virtuous rulers in Ming history. He was famously faithful to his empress, monogamous, by every indication, in a system explicitly designed for polygamy. He treated his court with unusual kindness. He was beloved. What almost no one at court knew, for the first years of his life, was that he existed at all. His mother was a concubine of extremely low rank, a woman whose origins, depending on which source you trust, were either from the far southern provinces or from a tribal group beyond the conventional boundaries of Han Chinese society. She caught the emperor's eye during a casual visit to the storage rooms of the inner palace, an encounter documented years later. After the fact, when it became politically necessary to establish the heir's legitimate parentage. When the child was born, the sitting Empress Dowager and her political allies wished to suppress the birth entirely. Concubines who gave birth without the knowledge of the court hierarchy, or whose pregnancies represented threats to other candidates for succession, were sometimes quietly forced to end those pregnancies. The records are careful about this, deliberately vague, clinically euphemistic. But the pattern, across multiple dynasties, is consistent enough that historians no longer debate whether it happened, only how frequently. The Hongzhi Emperor's mother hid her pregnancy. When the child was born, she hid the child. For years, he was kept in secret in a part of the palace that official visitors never entered. Fed and cared for by a small group of loyal attendants, including eunuchs who risked everything by participating in the deception. His existence was a secret kept inside the world's most surveilled building. When he was finally revealed to his father, the emperor moved beyond expression to discover he had a living son, elevated the child, and recognized him. His mother's situation improved dramatically, for a time, and then she died. Under circumstances that official history records as illness and unofficial whispers recorded as something else. Her son became emperor. He spent his reign, it has been argued by historians, trying to be everything the system that had nearly destroyed him was not: faithful, kind, merciful. Whether this represents psychological consequence or political calculation, we cannot know. By the time of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, which ruled from 1644 until 1912, the concubine system had been in operation in various forms for nearly 2,000 years. It had accumulated centuries of tradition, bureaucratic refinement, and moral justification. It had also accumulated centuries of evidence that it was destroying the women inside it and destabilizing the dynasties it was meant to protect. The Qing court formalized and codified the system in ways that actually increased documentation, which is why we know more about Qing concubines than about those of earlier periods. The hierarchy was strict and well recorded. Entry procedures were documented. Rank changes were logged. Deaths were noted. And yet, even this documentation exists primarily to serve administrative purposes. The women remain, in the official record, essentially functions rather than people, vessels for the imperial bloodline, contributors to dynastic stability, objects of regulated access. The most famous Qing concubine, the woman known to history as the Empress Dowager Cixi, is in some ways the final, most dramatic expression of everything the system was designed to prevent. A concubine from a mid-ranking Manchu family, she entered the Qianlong Emperor's court around 1851 at the age of 15. She rose through the ranks with unusual speed, partly because she was genuinely talented and partly because she bore the emperor a son, his only surviving male heir. When the emperor died in 1861, that son became the child emperor Tongzhi. And Cixi, now Empress Dowager, became the most powerful woman in China, a position she would hold, with one brief interruption, for the next 47 years. She ruled. Effectively by most measures, and controversially by almost all of them. She made decisions about foreign policy, military strategy, court appointments, and dynastic succession. She outlived her own son, managed his successor, and dominated the Qing court through the most turbulent period of China's modern history: the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, the beginning of the end of the imperial system itself. She was not beloved by the Confucian scholars who wrote history. She was described in terms that echo Wu Zetian's treatment 1,000 years earlier, as unnatural, manipulative, and morally corrupt. Rumors about her personal life were circulated and amplified. Her political decisions were interpreted through the lens of her gender in ways that her male counterparts' decisions were not. She died in 1908. The last emperor, a child named Pui, was enthroned. 4 years later, the dynasty fell. the Forbidden City fell silent. With the end of the Qing dynasty, the imperial concubine system ended too formally, legally, finally. The women who remained in the Forbidden City in 1912 were, for the first time in 2,000 years, technically free. What that meant in practice was often complicated. Many were middle-aged or elderly women who had known no other world. Many had no family to return to. Some remained in the palace complex, while Pui maintained his bizarre existence there as a puppet emperor, a vestige of a system that no longer existed, surrounded by women whose function no longer existed either. When Pui was finally expelled from the Forbidden City in 1924 by the warlord Feng Yuxiang, the last remnants of the imperial household scattered. Some concubines returned to provincial families. Some died in poverty. A very few left memoirs, invaluable documents that give us some of the most direct accounts we have of what life inside the system had actually felt like. One of those memoirs, written by a court lady named Der Lang, who had served in Cixi's inner court, describes with unusual candor the boredom, the loneliness, the rigid protocol, and the occasional moments of human warmth that coexisted inside the palace walls. It is not a document of horror. Derling's account is relatively privileged. But it is a document of constraint, so total that it constituted its own kind of suffocation. She wrote about watching concubines who had served for decades, women who had entered as girls and who were now visibly old. Their youth spent waiting, performed the same rituals they had always performed, in quarters that had not changed, in a world that had continued without them. So what do we take from all of this? What do we make of a system that lasted 2,000 years, consumed millions of women's lives, and was then so thoroughly erased from the record that we are still, in the 21st century, piecing together what it actually looked like from the inside? The first thing to recognize is that the erasure was not careless. It was not the result of poor record-keeping or historical accident. It was deliberate. The men who wrote imperial history, Confucian scholars, court officials, professional historians, made active choices about what was worth recording and what was beneath the dignity of the historical record. Women's inner lives, women's suffering, women's resistance. These did not constitute, in their framework, history. They were domestic matters, private affairs, irrelevant to the real story of dynasties and battles and philosophical schools. This is why the fragments we have are so precious. The Korean records of the concubines who died at the Yongle Emperor's funeral, the poetry written by concubines and occasionally preserved, the memoirs of court ladies, the archaeology of imperial tombs. These fragments exist because women found ways, despite everything, to leave traces of themselves, to insist, even in a system designed to render them invisible, on their own existence. The second thing to recognize is that the concubine system was not simply a product of cruelty. It was a product of logic, a specific, coherent, eternally consistent set of assumptions about governance, sexuality, and the nature of power. The emperors who maintained thousands of concubines were not uniquely monstrous men. Many of them were, by the standards of their time, thoughtful administrators, capable generals, even humane rulers. The system existed because it made sense within a framework of assumptions that most of their contemporaries shared, assumptions about women's social role, about the nature of the imperial office, about the relationship between the state and the family. What made it devastating was precisely that logic. Systems justified by internal logic are harder to challenge than systems justified only by violence. The women inside the Forbidden City could not appeal to a higher principle. Because the system rested on the highest principles, their world recognized cosmic order, dynastic continuity, Confucian ethics. Their suffering was not a bug. It was, by the system's own accounting, irrelevant. And that, the systematic irrelevance of individual human experience in service of institutional continuity, is the thing that echoes most clearly from the history of the imperial concubine system into our own time. Not as a comfortable historical curiosity, but as a warning about what happens when we build systems so large, so logical, and so self-perpetuating that the people inside them stop being visible. 2,000 years of empire. 9,000 women inside a single palace. One woman calling for her mother in a foreign language as she died. The history that was erased was not just the history of concubines. It was the history of what it costs to build civilizations on the invisible labor and invisible suffering of people whose names we are only now beginning to recover. The Forbidden City still stands in Beijing. Millions of tourists walk through its gates every year, marveling at its scale, its architecture, its extraordinary preservation. They see the dragon throne. They see the ceremonial halls. They see the gardens where emperors walked. What they almost never see, what the tour guides almost never mention, are the hundreds of quiet courtyards tucked behind the main axis of the palace, where thousands of women lived and aged and died without ever being chosen. Those courtyards are still there. They are smaller than you'd expect. Their walls are high. And if you stand in them and look up at the strip of sky visible above, you begin to understand, in your body rather than your mind, what it must have meant to spend a lifetime looking up at exactly that. Some stories can only be recovered in fragments, but fragments are enough to demand that we look. If you found value in this story and the recovery of these forgotten lives, then please subscribe, so we can keep bringing hidden chapters of history back into the light. Leave a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you most, because your responses genuinely shape the histories we explore next. And if you know someone who cares about the story's history tried to erase, share this with them. The women of the Forbidden City spent their lives invisible. The least we can do is see them now.